Have you ever thought, why don't they teach that in school? As a teacher of 23 years myself, I noticed that students had less and less of some of the basic skills they needed for everyday life. You know, things like how to write a thank you note, how to make a phone call, how to apologize, how to write a check and balance your account, how to sew on a button, how to clean the bathroom and vacuum and do laundry, how to operate a fire extinguisher, how to turn off the water to the house. And thus, Adulting 101 was born. You can go to jamesdevine.net, click on the Adulting 101 course link, and take a view of a few free lessons. And if you like what you see, sign up for the full course, and you can get 30% off as a Cool Grandpa listener. Just enter the code COOLGRANDPA at checkout.
Hey folks, I want to talk to you about this application Readio. I strongly recommend Readio to help grandparents and parents read to their grandchildren remotely when they can't be in the same room. Whether you're living across the country, across the world, or you're just gone on a business trip, Readio makes it easy for you to read to those young ones when you're away. It's a super easy tool that allows for video monitoring across the top of the screen so they can see you and you can see them, as well as having the book prominently displayed, making it easy for you to read to those young ones, or better yet, having them read to you. What I want you guys to do is go to cool-grandpa.us, look for the affiliate link for Readio, click on that link, and sign up today for your free trial. Hello, and welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is your host, Greg Payne, coming at you from Studio 12. This podcast is about being the best possible grandpa you can be, focusing on what it is to be a grandpa and how we can all share that experience together for our grandchildren. Welcome back. I'm glad that you're here for this conversation with Dee Dee. Dee Dee runs the website called More Than Grand. More Than Grand is focusing on how important it is to be a grandparent and do that role well. Now, Dee Dee had started out as a communications consultant, so she knew where to begin in understanding how vital communication is, not just with the grandchildren, but with the parents as well. We're not always real clear with our communication with our kids or with their partners. So Dee Dee has created this More Than Grand website, and it's got a ton of resources in it. So I know you're going to enjoy this conversation, and I know that you guys are really going to enjoy checking out the More Than Grand website and checking out some of these resources that Dee Dee has. A lot of them are free resources, and then there's some really good paid resources as well. So be sure to go to the show notes and check those out. But without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Dee Dee. Hi, Dee Dee. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. This is going to be a fabulous conversation because I think we have similar projects, different, but kind of coming at this thing with being a grandparent very similar. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down and visit with the Cool Grandpa Podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here and to talk to your audience about some of the wonderful things about being a grandparent.
One of the things that I'm going to enjoy about this conversation is I'm asking the initial question that I give grandpas is, what was your reaction when you found out that you were going to become a grandmother for the first time?
Well, it's funny because I was still a full-time mom when I found out I was going to be a grandmother. We have 4 children who are quite spread apart in age. So we actually still had a child in high school when I found out I was going to be a grandmother. And we were absolutely thrilled because my son was just one of those people who was born to parent. And it was so exciting to know that he was finally going to get to do something like that. He was one of the older cousins and always had a flock of little children following him everywhere he went. So it was just, I was just thrilled for him and his wife.
Oh, that's great. And I always love asking these questions because we run the gambit sometimes with our own life experiences from the, I'm not old enough to be a grandparent to, boy, it's about time the kids finally made me a grandparent. And so it's wonderful to hear everybody's different reactions to this question.
Absolutely. I think so much of it has to do with whether you've been waiting a while or not. And for us, since we, still had kids at home, it seemed a little soon, but we knew it wasn't for my son. So
One of the things, like I said initially, that was interesting was when I found out I was going to be a grandfather, I was searching around for information about, okay, how am I going to do this job? How am I going to dive in here and be the best grandpa ever? And, have kids singing songs about me in the hills and all that kind of fun stuff, right? And I
right.
looked around, there wasn't a whole lot there. And I know your experience was something similar, but take me back to where you were when you were becoming a grandmother and what you were looking around for.
Yeah, I've kind of found the same thing, Greg. I looked for resources to help me understand how to be an effective grandparent. There were lots of options for how to be a fun grandparent. There were lots of websites dedicated to activities and different ways of making your grandchildren love you. There was a big emphasis. What I saw everywhere was, spoil them and send them home, and that just didn't resonate with me. And I knew that there were other people like me out there that wanted to know more about how to be a good partner as a grandparent. So I started a website myself, and I started More Than Grand about, it's coming up on 2 years ago now. And my emphasis is entirely on how to be the best grandparent possible by partnering with the parents. And I think that is the key to really having a good relationship with your grandchildren and your children. Too many people forget about the fact that their relationship with their adult children is still important when those grandchildren come along.
Oh, absolutely. And it was interesting that you were talking about partnering with the parents, because I think too a lot of us have had ideas or role models previously where people became grandparents and it was almost like they washed their hands, they like to spoil the grandkids, but they kind of either stopped or felt like they needed to stop being a parent. And then also, I think too, having that relationship confused a little bit about what are appropriate boundaries and who sits at the head of the table at Thanksgiving and who
Right.
do, all these little things that, you don't really think about. But then I think it also causes a lot of apprehension and assumptions between parents and grandparents.
Absolutely. And I started doing a lot of research, looking for feedback from parents, especially about what it is that they need from grandparents and what it is that drives them crazy when grandparents do it. And after I did that, I polled grandparents to see what it was they thought that parents wanted. And it was really clear to me that grandparents were not hearing what parents were asking for. And if you look at the research, it shows that, I can't remember. I'm very bad at numbers off the top of my head, but I believe it's around 67% of parents have asked grandparents to change something that they're doing, and the vast majority of those grandparents don't change. They either say they're going to and then don't, or say, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm just, I'm going to keep giving them the cookies before dinner, or whatever it is. And so it was obvious to me that grandparents weren't even realizing the problems that they were causing. And that's when I decided I wanted to find a way to create a resource that grandparents could use to have the conversations with their children, with their adult children, to try to avoid some of those things before they even come up.
Were you finding that there was a case of, as I was suggesting a little bit, of like grandparents hit, whether it's a certain age, let's say 50s and 60s, and certainly grandparents are younger, grandparents are older, of this is how I did it. I've reached a certain age. I don't need to change. And they're becoming really fixed in what they wanted? Or was it a case of maybe they were just tone deaf and not even realizing?
I think it probably varies, but overall, the feeling I got was that grandparents went into it. I'm a grandparent now. This is my chance to be a grandparent, and this is how I want to do it. So it wasn't even that they were, thinking that their way was better. It was just that as a grandparent, they felt that they have certain rights, and that their role includes certain things, and they just can't seem to think beyond that. And so one of the key things that I try to get across is that grandparents are just in a supporting role in the whole thing, and it's the parents that are the directors. So it's really important as a supporting actor to listen to the directors and find out what they need from you, and follow those instructions. So
Yeah. And I wonder too if maybe some of this has to do with, similar to what we were discovering a few years ago, where there wasn't a whole lot to this. Popular media shows grandparents either aloof, bumbling idiots, drunk on the couch, whatever it is. And sometimes those are okay in the context of the movie or the TV show. But when that's all that people see, and especially as you're coming up in your 30s and 40s and starting to get to that grandparent horizon, yeah, you kind of make up and you role play in your head. Well, I guess this is how grandparent is going to be and how I'm going to do this.
right. And that message, when somebody says they're going to be a grandparent, so often they say, I can't wait to spoil them. And that just drives me crazy, because there is literally nothing else in life that we set out to spoil. Spoil is nothing but a negative word. We don't want to spoil your vacation. We don't want to spoil a joke. We don't want to spoil the end of the movie. We don't, any other time we use that word, it's negative. And so I just, it irks me that we decide that's the word to use for our grandchildren. Now I understand that the desire to dote on them and to, indulge them, and that's all something that is okay. But I just wish we could erase the word spoil them from the grandparent vocabulary.
Oh, yeah. And I think too, when I'm talking with grandfathers in particular, is that at least on the grandfather side, I think when we tend to think about doting on the grandkids, it's about doing activities with them as much. You don't hear, I mean, you definitely hear, I had my old buddies on talking about their grandfather and milkshakes and ice cream at 9:30 a.m.
Yeah.
That's the total exception to the rule and all that. And I get it. But I think too, is that, we're looking for experiences so much with the kids versus, because it doesn't help the grandchildren out to overindulge in sweets or overindulge in anything and then turn around and give them back to the parents. Now their joke is, hey, we're going to get them all hyped up on sugar and everything, turn around and give them to the kids. Ha ha ha.
Right.
And totally get it. Totally. I probably have even said that myself, but I think to your point, it comes to the grandparents' responsibility as an auxiliary to the parents to follow their rules and follow what they have in mind. And it's one thing to slip a chocolate chip cookie in before lunch. It's another thing to blow whatever diet they have completely.
Absolutely. And I think we as grandparents underestimate how much harder parenting is now in the age of social media. I mean, we had our, one or two baby books that we went to for advice, plus our doctor and our mother. And now, parents today are faced with input from everywhere on what sort of job they're doing as a parent. So to have grandparents add to that, or to have grandparents not respect, the choices they're making, just makes it that much harder.
I can only imagine if my mom had been on Facebook when I was growing up, and when I would take off on the summers on my bike, and it was one of those, and it was the times we grew up in, I was off. She had no idea where I was. If she
Right.
was calling, if she wanted to track me down, she's calling 3 or 4 of my friends where I might be at their houses, trying to figure out, am I at somebody's house, or am I down at the pool, or am I over at the lake, or whatever. And today, that parent that would allow a child to do those activities would be almost crucified on faith. How can
Yeah.
you let it's so endangering, it's so everything. So
Right. Right.
you've got a good point where, hey, grandparents, we don't need to be adding on to the pressures, plus the pressure of looking at those posts for parents and going, oh my gosh, I'm not a good enough mom.
Right.
I let my kid lick the batter out of the bowl when I was making a cake, and now he's got salmonella, and oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's definitely harder now. So that's, my hope is that by helping grandparents be better support for parents, it can make parents' life a little bit easier.
What have you found, or what are some of the tips you have for starting that communication early? Because I'm assuming the earlier you start it, let's say a new couple comes in, says, mom and dad, guess what? We're having a baby. We start those conversations about what can we do to support you, and how do you want us to grandparent? And
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's one, I have an online course. I use the term course lightly. It's more of a guide that helps um, walk grandparents through the steps that can be useful. I have a free checklist that can be helpful. Um, but it recommends that first you kind of figure out what it is you want out of grandparenting, because that's an important part of it. It is an exciting time for us, and it's important to figure out what it is you want. Do you want to be the fun grandpa? Do you want to be the grandmother who introduces the children to culture? Do you want to be, the grandfather who helps them understand the stock market? What are the things that are important to you that you want to pass on? But once you figure that out, it's important to talk to the parents about that so that they know where you're coming from. And then the next thing to do is to talk to them about how you can help. The guide that I have, New Grandparent Essentials, walks through about 20 questions that are important to ask new parents, um, because there are so many potential landmines out there, from the in-laws who show up at the hospital, to uninvited to witness the birth when the daughter or daughter-in-law really just wants her partner there, to feeding them things that they shouldn't be eating yet or ever, to screen time, bedtime, discipline, all of those things. My guide includes a lot of those questions, but the most important thing is not asking the questions. It's listening to the answers and respecting their wishes. And that's where grandparents have, I think, the most trouble. And that's why with the guide, writing these things down helps you actually make sure you've heard what they've said, and increases the chances that you're going to respect those wishes.
well, and I think that's a great point, in that as parents becoming grandparents, we have to shift gears a little bit from
Yeah,
being, hey, we know best because we're the parent, even though that we don't know best, but we're doing the best we can, to
exactly.
taking a step back and really listening to what are the grown children now, what are
Right,
their expectations.
right,
And we have to acknowledge too that what we knew of raising children in, I'm just, for myself, raising children in the 90s in the early 2000s is different now from what it is, in 2021. There's always going to be some things where parents are going to smirk and going to go, oh, that's crazy.
Right.
Why are they doing that? But sometimes you just have to go with it, because the kids are anxious to try to be the best parents that they can be, hopefully.
Absolutely. And you have to respect that. And one of the things that, I talk about is that you're not just entering a new role, that you're not just becoming a grandparent, you are establishing new relationships. And that includes new relationships with your own children, because instead of them just being your adult child, they are a parent. And that requires a shift in your perspective, and trying to navigate any new relationship is difficult. So it's important that you do it thoughtfully, that you're aware that it does require some effort.
Well, and I think too, something that grandparents maybe ought to consider is that if you've done your job well in raising your children, not that they're going to be perfect, not that you're perfect, is that they should be taking on more responsibilities and having a broader view. And what comes with that means that your direct input becomes less, in terms of you're going to become more of that consultant.
Right.
And you're going to become more of that, your resource there to quietly chime in when appropriate, but be there as a resource that they can reach out to, versus you constantly directing what they should do.
Absolutely. They are now the director. And so, that is a hard shift for a lot of people.
Now, have you noticed any differences with these shifts between grandmothers and grandfathers? Not that one would be better or worse, but sometimes there's just differences in roles and personalities.
I think a lot of it depends on how hands-on the parents were to begin with. So, typically our generation and generations before us, the mother was more hands-on than the father. And in those cases, the grandmother is generally more likely to be the one that has trouble stepping back. But in families where dad was very, very active in the raising of the children, the grandfather can have just as much trouble with ceding that authority, that role to the kids. So, I think it's probably more grandmothers, but I think that's more just because of the way that families have been structured up till now.
Well, and that's a good insight in terms of, if people can identify their partner being the stronger one that's harder to step back or whatnot, that can be something where that's a partner to partner discussion.
Right.
Of like, hey, honey, on the way, I want to talk to you about what I've been seeing. And here's where some things are, where it's making some things difficult for the kids. And that's
absolutely.
a hard conversation as well. But, I think part of this is have those hard conversations and do it early versus doing it late.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm really hoping to get new grandparents to visit the website and take advantage of the resources. There are a lot of free resources as well as the paid ones. And I've had some just wonderful stories from grandparents who have gone through these things. I know one grandmother said that she had always had a good relationship with her daughter, but her daughter didn't share much personally. She always kept things really close to the chest. And she started going through the questions that were included in New Grandparent Essentials. And she just asked her one question at a time. She'd ask her one question and they'd talk about that. And she said, she just kept it to 1 to 2 a week. And she said, as the weeks went on, her daughter just started opening up more and more about things that were way beyond the scope of the guide. And she said it just completely changed their relationship, that they had become so close because of the way they were able to talk about these things. And, that was so gratifying to know that what I had structured, what we had, worked to get these questions to help create that sort of relationship was actually working.
I think too, or at least it sounds like to me, is that there's a lot of pressure, and maybe I'm being general, or I don't know what I'm talking about. You tell me, but especially with that daughter-in-law, and mother-in-laws,
Yes.
thinking that there's a lot of judgment. There's a lot of looking over my shoulder. Am I doing things right? And I remember the old commercial. I think it was Endust, where the mother-in-law shows up to the house and pulls out a white glove from her
Right.
purse and is doing the finger swipe along the railing and different things. And the wife was just so relieved that Endust had helped her out. But that showed, like, I think how stressful sometimes it can be, especially if it's not your own mom or dad,
Right.
from a parent. So
Right.
are you finding that parents, because of that, there's some anxiety and not wanting to open up perhaps?
Absolutely. And I think that that's another thing that another one of the messages that we get is just bite your tongue, don't say anything. And I don't think that's very good advice either. Now, obviously there are times where we need to not say what we want to say, but we shouldn't just stop talking. The communication is such a huge part of any healthy relationship, and it's not any different here. So if you can, use some of these tools to foster a better relationship with, and it often is the daughter-in-law, um, that's just going to make family life better for everyone forever, basically. And to be able to establish open communication and respectful communication early on in a young family's life, it's a true gift.
Before we go on, these online courses and the checklist, those are all to be found at the morethangrand.com, right?
Correct.
At the website.
Correct.
And I'll be
Yeah.
sure to put links to those in the show notes
Great.
as well. But have you found, or within the blogs that are on the site, any particular ways to have some of these conversations, such as, hey, take the young family out to dinner and, do it away from the home. Some of that.
Right, right. And that's something that I should probably address more. I just kind of touch on it in the guide. I emphasize that it's important to find a quiet time to introduce it as, I've I've got some questions I'd like to ask you, and this is why. And explain to them that you really just want to understand better, and you want to be able to help support them. And so that seems to be effective. Depending on your circumstances, out to dinner might be a great option, but that's not possible for everybody. Not everybody's close by. So there are a variety of ways to do that, but that's a great idea. And I can see a blog post coming up on that. So
Yeah, because I remember too, in some of my early like marriage counseling and people talking to me, is sometimes if you have an issue that can be frustrating to one or both, go for a walk and have that discussion while you're going for a walk around the block, or
right.
do it, do something that's outside of the element where you guys are living. So I didn't know if there was something along those lines, like, hey, even if it's at a home, but, have a conversation around a casual meal or.
Right. Well, and I think that's one reason that it's so valuable to address some of these things when it's still expectant parents or when they're new parents, especially if you can do it before that baby comes. You haven't none of these things have come up yet. You haven't stepped on any toes, you haven't crossed any lines. It's everything is still open, and you can do it all from a neutral place.
Yeah, well, and you find out where those lines are instead of discovering it when tensions become high, or you step on, you
Exactly.
know, and so
Exactly.
some of that is because you can't always, let's say, trust your child that's in that relationship, because
Right.
it's still a new relationship, even if they're a couple of years in or 6 months in or whatever that is. It takes a few years to really understand the other person.
Absolutely. And even, even if they've been married 8 or 10 years before they have their first child, now they're in an entirely different relationship. Now they're relating as parents and that's, you're seeing sides of your partner that you have never seen before. So it is important. And that's one thing that, I talk about is making sure that both as grandparents that you approach this, if you have a grandparenting partner, that you approach it as a team, because it's important to recognize that the other people in the relationship have valuable input and should be included.
Yeah. Now, a question I've got too is that any advice or any studies that you've seen as far as how, let's say there's two grandparents on either side, and sometimes there's different numbers, but
Right.
sake of this,
4 or 6.
we've got multiple grandparents here, about
Right.
how the grandparents, on both sides can come together and work some of these things out as well and have these discussions.
Well, it's funny. I firmly believe that you can only focus on your relationships. And so I haven't done much for working with the other grandparents. I do talk about including them in things and recognizing the importance of them. But I also encourage grandparents not to focus on what the other grandparents are doing, except in a few cases. One of them is gift giving. I think it's really helpful for grandparents to not try to outdo one another. And so if you are lucky enough to be the wealthier grandparent, just scale it back. Just don't put money in a college fund or something that doesn't make that child realize that they've got 7 presents from Grandma and Grandpa Smith and one $5 bill from Grandma and Grandpa Jones. So that's the one area that I really encourage grandparents to be aware of what the other grandparents are doing and how they're approaching things.
No, that's good advice. I know the grandkids will hate it, but
Yeah.
that's good. That's good advice for the grandparents.
They don't know any different for so long.
Right. What are some of the ways, I think in some of the blogs you talked about picking out the grandparents' names or grandma names and how that settles in?
And it's funny because I don't have a one for grandfathers. Because in my experience, and maybe you can tell me I'm wrong here, in which case I'll go put one together, grandfathers know what they want to be called. I have not found too many grandfathers that agonize over what the grandkids are going to call them. How do you feel?
I don't, speaking for all grandfathers,
Yes.
I don't think we agonize over it nearly as much as maybe our wives, and because I think for us, we're good with grandpa or grandfather, and it could be pop or it could be some derivative of that, or it could be, like in my case, it may end up being Grandpa Greg. But I think it's more of a case of almost looking at grandpa or grandfather or whatever as much as a title or a way to address somebody. Much more than, or maybe not as important as what grandmas get called.
Yeah. And there is a lot of agonizing. That is my most downloaded offering is, 242 grandmother names, because it is hard. I had a terrible time. I just could not wrap my head around any grandmother name. They just all sounded like they were talking about somebody else.
Wow. Do you think that's because grandmas are trying to personalize it so much?
Partially, and I think a lot of it is also to do with grandmother, grandma. They sound old. and grandmothers are younger and younger. The average age that you become a grandparent is 50. So it's really hard to imagine yourself as grandma when your grandma is still alive,
Right. Right. Well, and especially too, and I wonder if this is something where uh, so many women in the workforce now versus 30, 40 years ago. And when that started to increase, right? Because women
Right.
that are in their late 40s and 50s are, I'm taking white collar business, is your middle to upper management typically at that point, or
Right.
at least a senior
Something or other. Yeah.
right? And this idea of grandma being attached to that, I wonder if
Yeah.
there's something to it in terms of trying to balance that out between I'm a director of personnel or I'm a VP of finance,
Right.
but then I've got this grandmother thing
Right.
over here too.
Right. Yeah. So it's, and it's individual for everybody. There are some
Sure.
people that still just love the idea of being grandma, and they know that's what they want to be because they have such fond memories of their grandmother or whatever it may be.
Not to interrupt, but I'll tell you a funny one with my wife's mom, my kids, and where her grandma name came from. So my wife and our oldest were visiting, and my son knew that his mom was his boss. And so there was a question as far as, well, who's this person?
Right.
And that was like, well, that's grandma, and grandma is mom's boss when she was trying to figure things out. So she became grandma boss.
I love it.
All the way to the end.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that was a unique one that was just kind of a spontaneous, not a Nana, not a,
Right.
this.
And I think those spontaneous ones are often the best. And that's one of the things that I tell people is that no matter what you pick, you may end up with something entirely different once that child starts talking. So don't get too attached to anything.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It'll be because it'll evolve
Right.
as they start to speak and communicate, and what sounds can come out, and
right.
All of that.
No.
So, Dee Dee, anything else maybe that about grandparenting that we haven't really touched on that you would like to bring up and talk about?
Well, I just, I want to, again, I think we've touched on it, but I can't emphasize enough how important communication is to having a good relationship with your grandchildren. And that communication starts with their parents. I think it's overlooked too often. I think too many grandparents are thinking about just the relationship with their grandchildren and not remembering how important it is to keep the relationship with their adult kids at the forefront.
That's great advice. And I can tell you too, in the little bit that I've been trying to do some of those communication, talking about when we're going up to visit our kids and our grandkids, especially with the daughter-in-laws, because if I tell my son, it never gets to
It
the
never gets, you're correct.
never does. So guys, grandpas, if you have daughter-in-laws, you need to go to the daughter-in-laws.
Yes.
Yes. Because it's not going to, the message is going to change. It's the telephone game. But I found when I'm able to say, hey, when we're up here this week, here's the 3 things that we would like to do.
Right.
And some of that is involving the grandchild. And then some of it's not, because some of it's like, hey, we just want to take you guys out for dinner one night this week. Right. We want to do this. So at least when we're looking at calendars and we're in the go in the flow moment, they know that there's 3 or 4 things that I would like us to do in that go in the flow moment.
Absolutely. And that's the perfect example of making sure that you have communicated what's important to you. Now, I'm sure that when you get up there and the whole week is chaos and it turns out that only one of those 3 things happens, you understand that that's how it works sometimes. And that's the other part of the equation, recognizing that no matter how carefully laid your plans may be, that, again, you're not in the driver's seat. So.
Right. You're a concerned passenger.
Exactly.
So,
And being a backseat driver is no good in that situation.
no, absolutely not. So, Dee Dee, I really do appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down and visit with us and give us a little bit of a grandma's perspective, as well as talk to us about More Than Grand. It's a fascinating and it's a great website with a ton of blogs and resources, like you said. So we'll be sure to put those in the show notes. But I appreciate this time that you sat down with us and had this discussion.
Well, thank you so much. And Greg, I have to tell you, I'm so glad that you started this podcast because as you recognized, most of the resources out there are aimed at grandmothers. That's another thing that I've really tried to be cognizant of with my website is that grandfathers are interested and want to be involved also. So I'm so glad that there's some more resources for them.
Well, thank you so much and have a good evening.
You too.
Man, I really enjoyed this conversation with Dee Dee. I thought it was really interesting to hear from a grandma's perspective about how she reacted with the news that she was becoming a grandma for the first time. And I really enjoyed those conversations we had, especially around the daughters and daughter-in-laws and how as grandparents we can really help them out through clear communication to really understand and support what they're going through. I'm not sure if there's been a more challenging time for moms. Certainly any time is a challenging time for moms. But I think today with social media and everybody posting only the good parts of being a mom or working with the kids, I think that adds an additional layer of stress. And it was great to hear about how as grandpas and grandmas, moms and dads, we can support those kids and support their role as new parents. So what was your big takeaway from this conversation? Do me a favor, go to the show notes, leave us a comment. I know Dee Dee would love to hear from you, so certainly on her website, there's a contact page. Drop Dee Dee a line. Let her know what you thought about this conversation. And until next time, remember to stay cool. Thank you for listening to the Cool Grandpa Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and share it with a friend. That's the best way you can help us to expand our community, as well as get the news out about how valuable grandpas are in the lives of those kids. If you'd like to leave me a comment or shoot me a potential topic for this podcast, please go to www.cool-grandpa.us. Look for the comments tab, fill it out, hit submit. It's as easy as that. Until next time, remember to stay cool.